Welcome to this lecture about drought. The greatest physiological advantage of terrestrial life compared to aquatic life is the easy access to oxygen. However, the greatest physiological threat to life on land is the danger of dehydration. Successful large-scale evolution of terrestrial life has taken place, and especially species in the phyla vertebrates and arthropods have evolved to live and thrive in some of the driest and hottest habitats on Earth. Furthermore, actually, some snails, which belong to the phyla mollusk, thrive on land and can be seen as truly terrestrial. Some even live in deserts. However, in general, the threat of dehydration is a serious barrier to terrestrial life, and many terrestrial animals depend on the selection of suitable moist habitats and are terrestrial only in the technical sense of the word. They will demand a high degree of moisture in the surroundings. For example, animals like frogs, many snails, and earthworms are highly dependent on moist environments. In our research group, we work with soil invertebrates, and therefore this lecture will focus on drought in relation to those. So before we go on, I would like to say, why are soil fauna interesting and relevant? The soil fauna plays an important role for soil ecosystems. The engineered species, such as earthworms, influence soil structure by increasing the soil porosity and the pore size in the soil by their tunneling through the soil. Furthermore, earthworms and inco trees ingest considerable amount of dead plant material and soil, thereby mixing organic matter and mineral soil. Many soil invertebrates contribute to the fragmentation of plant litter, which increases the surface so it's much more easily decomposed by soil bacteria and fungi. The grassing of inco trees, mites and columbella on bacteria and fungi furthermore stimulates the microbial decomposition. And by grassing and moving around in the soil, they also help spreading microorganisms to new litter, and in that way stimulates the decomposition. All of this improves the growth condition for plants, improves the nutrient cycling in the soil, and the decomposition of organic matter. All very important to healthy soils. So, just to say, soil invertebrates may be small and often neglected, but nevertheless they are very important for healthy soils. So, besides being very important, how do they live in the soil? Soil invertebrates are in many ways not truly terrestrial, since they are highly dependent on humid habitats. Physiologically, soil invertebrates have many similarities with freshwater animals and need high humidity in their surrounding, otherwise they will lose water by evaporation. Evaporation is the type of vaporization that occurs on the surface of water, as water changes into the gas phase. When a water molecule near the surface absorbs energy enough to overcome the vapor pressure, it will escape and enter the surrounding air as a gas. Since the energy of a molecule is proportional to temperature, evaporation proceeds more quickly at higher temperature. So, evaporation increases with temperature. If the air contains water vapor, the difference between the water vapor pressure at the surface of the water and in the air will be less, and the driving force for water vapor to diffuse from the water surface and into the air will correspondingly be reduced. So, an estimate for the driving force for evaporation is the vapor pressure difference, often measured in millimeter mercury. The vapor pressure of pure water is higher than the vapor pressure of a solution, so increasing osmolality will decrease the vapor pressure of a solution and thereby reduce evaporation. Let me introduce you to humidity relations in soil. Soil water is found in the soil pores and spaces between soil particles. The air in the soil pore is often saturated with water vapor, which give a relative humidity close to 100%. During drought, plant will absorb water from the soil and there will be evaporation from the soil surface. If this continues, then at some point the plant will not be able to absorb more water from the soil because the water potential in the soil becomes as high as the osmotic potential in the plant. This point is called the permanent wilting point. It's around minus 15 bars, which correspond to a relative humidity of approximately 98.9%, which does not sound very dry. If you think about the air humidities that we humans experience, then, for instance, in my office right now, there's around 60% relative humidity, and that does not feel that dry. But it's totally different in the soil. Take, for instance, a springtail. We have it here, the columbella, that had an osmotic pressure of around minus 7 bars, which corresponds approximately to a relative humidity of 99.5%. This means that when the humidity becomes lower than that, there will be a transport of water out of the animal. And we know that they're very permeable and resemble freshwater animals in many sense, but they have developed a lot of strategies and mechanisms that actually enable them to cope with relatively dry soils. But how do they cope with these dry soils? Animals living in the soil or on the soil surface will occasionally be exposed to drought. And then they have several options. One option is to migrate to moist microhabitats and escaping the drought. Some earthworms, for example, they will in dry periods migrate deeper into the soil where there is more humid. That's a way to escaping. But when evading drought is not possible, animals have to cope with drought. And in general, there are two strategies. One is to reduce the water loss, and the other is to increase the tolerance of water loss. You could say, of course, reducing water loss would also be to migrate to moist microhabitat, but there is also other ways. But to achieve these, soil-living organisms have developed many different types of adaptations. Let's start looking at ways of reducing water loss. Changing behavior are one of the most used strategies to reduce water loss. This could be in terms of reducing the activity level or escaping from the drought in time and space. Earthworms, for example, have only very moderate morphological and physiological means for reducing water transport through the cuticula. During dry periods, earthworms may, as I just mentioned, migrate away down to deeper soil layers, but if drought are long-lasting, earthworms are forced to cope with desiccation stress by physiological means. Some earthworm species enter diapause during summer if the soil becomes too dry. Then the worm will excavatulate in a spherical cell in the soil, lined with muscus and ingested gut content. You can see it here on the picture. By coiling itself into this ball in soil, it can reduce the water loss tremendously. Evolutionarily, some species have evolved a resistance to desiccation by reducing the water contents of the skin or cuticula, also called the cuticular permeability. By reducing this, they hereby lowering the water loss by evaporation over the skin. The cuticular permeability is measured as microgram water lost per square centimeter of skin cuticula per hour per water vapor pressure difference. And the vapor pressure difference meaning between the inside of the animal and the outside. So by measuring this cuticular permeability, it says something about how easily an animal loses water to the surrounding. And I have taken this graph with the different animals and I hope it gives you a perspective of how permeable soil-living springtail and earthworms are. But let's start with the figure here in the N with the low cuticular permeability, and a low cuticular permeability means that they are more resistant of losing water. So they will lose less water in the same amount of time as the one in the high end. So for instance, down here we have the tsetse and the American cockroach, animals that can run around in free air without losing that much water. I also put in a human, not sweating, because of course sweating will increase the evaporation, but it's a human sitting still, and we have a cuticular permeability around 48. I also took in the garden snail. It's a little lower than a human, but it's because it has its shell to protect it. If we then go down the line and find one with more cuticular permeability, meaning they more easily lose water, then we have a slug like the Spanish slug. It's an invasive species we find here in Denmark. Very often we can find it on the pavement. It can crawl on the road and so forth. So it also seems a little bit more robust in losing water than, for instance, another slug I put in here is the mash slug, which really like humid habitats and are not that often found on roads and other dry places, you can say. Then there is also a frog in here, and then we have, when you come down to cuticular permeability of 400, then we have the Columbola, Fulsomia candida, and an earthworm. And if we really go down the line, then we find the salamander. That was the cuticular permeability. That does not say exactly how drought tolerant an organism are. It only says something about how easily water is lost over the surface. There are other ways of dealing with drought. Another strategy is to reduce the gradient in water vapor pressure between the inside of the organism and the surrounding. By reducing the gradient, you reduce the water lost by evaporation. This gradient can be changed by accumulating osmolytes, since the vapor pressure of a solution is lower than the vapor pressure of pure water. I've taken a figure over here where you see you have high vapor pressure in the pure water and lower in the air, and then water vapor will move from the water, or it could be from the organism, into the air. There will be a gradient. If we then give it some solutes, some osmolytes in solution, then it will lower the vapor pressure, and if this pressure then can come into equilibrium with the surroundings, then it will actually stop losing water. Some animals are actually able to increase the osmolality to such a degree that they can reabsorb water from a relatively dry surrounding by using osmolytes. Let me give you an example of that. Fulsomia candida is a soil-dwelling springtail and has a cuticular permeability around 400, as we saw before, which means that they easily lose water to the surroundings. They live in the soil pores where the humidity is normally very close to 100%, but they can survive dry periods. The hemolymph of Fulsomia candida is around -7 bars. This means that they will lose water if the soil humidities go below 99.5%. And as you may remember, the plant wilting point was around 98.9% relative humidity. A study has shown that Fulsomia candida is able to survive more than a week at 98.2% relative humidity. This is really dry. That's drier than the wilting point of plants. What can be the explanation for this? How can they do it? Let's look at this study. It can be seen as expected. If we held these animals in an atmosphere of 98.2% relative humidity, their water content will drop quickly within the first 24 hours. And at the same time, if we look at the osmotic pressure, it will increase. Because the animal lose water, we also see that they become wrinkly and inactive. The fascinating part is that the animal could actually increase their osmotic pressure to stop the water efflux. As you can see on the lower graph here, the candida actively increased the osmolality by synthesizing the polyol mu-inositol and the sugar glucose. Simply increasing those, that resulted in an increased osmotic pressure. And thereby, because the osmotic pressure was higher than the ambient water potential, they could actually reabsorb water. So there was a net influx of water by passive absorption from the atmosphere. The rehydration was also easy to see at the animal, which returned to a normal appearance and then again were fully active. Then on day 7, the dehydrated animals were returned to an environment of 100% relative humidity with free liquid water. This is what happened here. This abrupt shift to a rehydration environment forced the animal to remove osmolytes from their body fluids to avoid a lethal influx of water. Some animals died from this rapid shift, of course, because it's very rapid from a very dry condition to a very humid one. But all the survivors, they removed all the polyols and sugars within 48 hours and returned to normal condition. This was a way to avoid dehydration. But at the same time, it also demanded that they did tolerate losing a substantial amount of water in the beginning. So they should also have the ability to survive this inactive state for a period. But it's a very fascinating mechanism to be able to reuptake water from a dry air. Increased tolerance of water loss is another adaptation to a dry surroundings. Dehydration is harmful to non-adapted animals. Water is usually thought to be required for the living state, but surprisingly many organisms can survive a large degree of dehydration. Some can even survive almost complete dehydration. The extreme cases of dehydration tolerance is called anhydrobiosis. Anhydrobiotic organisms commonly survive even when more than 99% of their body water is removed, which will result in dry but viable tissue. Anhydrobiotic organisms may remain dry in this unique living state for decades or perhaps even centuries. Then, when water again becomes available, they will rapidly swell and resume an active life. But to be able to tolerate an extensive loss of body water, even though it's not nearly as much as under anhydrobiosis, it still demands both physiological and biochemical adaptation to survive it. Some of these adaptations are accumulation of osmolytes, not for their collegative properties, but for more specific properties to protect the cell and stabilize cell membranes and proteins. This was a short introduction to drought tolerance of soil invertebrates. The soil organisms are well adapted to the life they are living. However, climate change are predicted to result in altered precipitation pattern, including more intense summer drought over a large part of the world. Furthermore, drought tolerance could be affected by environmental contaminants, and several studies have already shown interaction between contaminants and natural stressors like drought. That we are going to look more into in the course. Thank you for listening.